Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into the suffocating reality of Victorian England, where the Industrial Revolution meant progress for some and a slow death for most. Before we begin, go ahead and like the video if you're enjoying the content, and subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into history's darker corners. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing our global community come together. Now, settle in. Maybe grab a drink, dim the lights if you can. Tonight's story isn't an easy one. It's about Thomas Blackwell, a textile worker in 1842 Manchester, whose daily existence makes our worst workdays look like a vacation. This is the story of what it really meant to be a factory worker when machines mattered more than the people operating them. Let's begin. Welcome to Victorian England, where progress smelled like coal smoke and human suffering, and the Industrial Revolution was less about revolution and more about revolving doors that fed workers in one end and spat out broken bodies at the other. This is the story of Thomas Blackwell, a textile factory worker in Manchester, 1842, whose daily existence made medieval peasants look like they were living in a spa resort. Thomas was 23 years old but looked 40, which tells you everything you need to know about Victorian factory work's effects on the human face. He'd been working at Grimshaw's cotton mill since he was 7, back when child labour wasn't controversial, just economical. His lungs were approximately 60% cotton fibre, his fingers were permanently stained with machine oil, and his life expectancy was roughly equivalent to that of a mayfly with a gambling problem. But let's start at the beginning, which was 4:30 in the morning, because Victorian factory owners believed that sleep was a luxury reserved for the wealthy and the dead, and workers were emphatically neither. Thomas lived in a tenement building that made modern slums look like the Ritz. He shared a single room with his wife, Mary, their 3 children who had survived infancy. 2 hadn't, but dwelling on infant mortality in Victorian England is a fast track to depression, his mother-in-law, and a family of rats who paid no rent but had squatters' rights dating back to 1835. The room measured approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, which meant personal space was a theoretical concept discussed by philosophers, not experienced by factory workers. The building itself was a masterpiece of architectural depression. 4 stories of brick and despair. It housed approximately 200 people in conditions that would make a sardine can look spacious. The walls wept with dampness, not metaphorically but literally, as though the building itself was crying about the human misery it contained. The privy, shared by all 200 residents, was located in the courtyard and emptied approximately never, creating a smell that could strip paint and had probably violated several of God's commandments regarding what humans should have to endure. But Thomas didn't have time to contemplate his living conditions, because the factory bell was ringing. And that bell was less a gentle reminder and more an auditory assault that suggested, if you weren't already awake, you were about to be fired. The bell ringer, a man named Jeremiah who had lost 3 fingers in a loom accident, and now had the perfect number of digits for his new career, swung the bell with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed ruining people's sleep. The sound carried across the factory district like an air raid siren designed by someone who hated humanity. It didn't just wake you up, it woke up your ancestors. Thomas rolled out of the straw mattress he shared with Mary, a mattress that had more in common with a burlap sack than with actual bedding, and began the morning ritual. This consisted of splashing his face with water from a communal bucket that looked like it had last been changed during the Napoleonic Wars, pulling on the same clothes he'd worn yesterday and the day before and would wear tomorrow, because owning multiple outfits was for aristocrats and people who weren't slowly starving. His shirt was linen, theoretically, though it had achieved a texture closer to cardboard through accumulated sweat and factory grime. His trousers had patches on the patches, a generational hand, me, down that had clothed his father before him, and would probably clothe his son after him, assuming any of them lived that long. His boots, the most valuable thing he owned besides his children, and even that was debatable on bad days, had been resoled so many times they were more soul than original boot. A ship of Theseus' philosophical puzzle you could wear on your feet. Mary stirred but didn't wake. She worked as a washerwoman. A job that destroyed your hands and back, but at least didn't require you to wake at 4:30 like some kind of agricultural nightmare. Their children, ages 9, 7, and 5, were still sleeping, packed together like puppies for warmth, because heating cost money and money was something they saw approximately twice a year. The 9-year-old William would join his father at the factory in a few hours. Child labour laws wouldn't become a thing until 1833's Factory Act, which limited children under 9 to working no more than 8 hours a day, and banned children under 9 from working in textile mills entirely, a truly revolutionary concept that suggested maybe 7-year-olds shouldn't be operating heavy machinery for 13-hour shifts. But William was 9, so he got to participate in the glorious industrial machine that was slowly grinding the working class into a fine paste. Thomas grabbed a piece of bread from the previous day, hard enough to be used as a weapon, dunked it briefly in weak tea to make it chewable, and headed out into the Manchester morning. The city at 4:45 was already alive, if you could call it living. It was more like a collective shambling toward economic survival. The streets were packed with workers heading to their various factories, mills, foundries, and workshops, all moving with the enthusiasm of prisoners marching toward execution, which wasn't far from the truth given factory accident rates. Manchester in 1842 was the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution, a title it wore like a crown made of coal dust and broken dreams. The city had grown from a market town of 20,000 in 1770 to an industrial behemoth of 300,000 by 1842. A growth rate that had overwhelmed any city planning that might have existed. The result was an urban hellscape that combined the worst aspects of medieval city design with cutting-edge industrial pollution. The air quality was spectacular, if by spectacular you mean you could see what you were breathing, and it was black. The smoke from hundreds of factory chimneys mixed with fog from the River Irwell to create what Manchester weather. But what environmental scientists would later recognize, less crime against human lungs. Breathing in Manchester was less about oxygen intake and more about filtering solid into your respiratory system until your lungs gave up and you had tuberculosis, which was the Victorian equivalent of saying someone died of being poor. The streets themselves were an adventure. The Industrial Revolution had brought jobs and prosperity, just not to the people actually doing the work or living in the city. The roads in the factory districts were unpaved, a mixture of mud, horse manure, human waste, because sewer systems were still a work in progress, and industrial runoff that created a substance that wasn't quite liquid and wasn't quite solid, but was definitely hazardous. Thomas navigated the streets with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing this walk for 16 years. You learned where the deep puddles were, which alleys smelled the worst, and which factory owners had guard dogs that were more interested in biting workers than protecting property. The walk to Grimshaw's cotton mill took 20 minutes, which doesn't sound long until you factor in the cold, the dark, the smell, and the crushing existential dread. Other workers joined the stream, a river of humanity flowing toward their various industrial prisons. No one spoke much. Conversation required energy, and energy was better saved for the 12-hour shift ahead. Some workers coughed, a distinctive hacking sound that marked veteran factory workers like a tribal identification. The cough came from years of breathing cotton fibers, coal dust, and whatever chemicals the factories used. Medical science at the time called it factory fever, or mill fever, though the actual medical term was, your lungs are becoming decorative art pieces made of scar tissue. Grimshaw's cotton mill appeared on the horizon like a Gothic cathedral dedicated to capitalism. It was a massive brick building, 4 stories tall and longer than a city block, with rows of windows that glowed with gaslight and a chimney that pumped black smoke into the atmosphere with the efficiency of a dragon with industrial ambitions. The building was beautiful if you found dystopian architecture inspiring. The bricks were dark red, stained black by decades of smoke. The windows were tall and narrow, perfect for light, but not for ventilation, because worker comfort was less important than maintaining proper humidity for the cotton. The main door was an enormous wooden portal that looked like it led to hell, which wasn't far from wrong. Thomas joined the queue at the door, where the overseer, Mr. Blackburn, checked everyone in. Blackburn was a middle-aged man who had risen from the ranks of workers to management, a journey that had somehow made him hate his former colleagues, more than the factory owners did. He held a pocket watch with the intensity of a man whose entire identity was built on punctuality and crushing the spirits of the working class. Blackwell 4:52, 2 minutes late. That's a penny docked from your wages, Blackburn announced with the satisfaction of a man who enjoyed his job a little too much. Thomas didn't argue. Arguing cost energy and would likely result in being sent home, which meant no wages at all. He'd left at 4:35. The walk took 20 minutes. The math didn't work, but factory owners had discovered that docking wages for imaginary lateness was an excellent way to improve profit margins. He entered the mill and was immediately assaulted by the noise. If you've never been in an industrial textile mill during full operation, imagine the sound of 1,000 demons playing drums made of metal while simultaneously running their fingernails down the world's largest chalkboard. Now amplify that by 10. The power looms created a sound that wasn't just loud but physically painful, a wall of noise that made conversation impossible and thinking difficult. The temperature inside was precisely calibrated to be miserable. The mill needed to be humid to prevent the cotton fibers from breaking, which meant it was kept between 75 and 85 degrees with near complete humidity. In winter, this felt merely oppressive. In summer, it was like working inside Satan's mouth during a particularly sweaty day. The smell was a complex bouquet of cotton, machine oil, human sweat, and despair. The cotton fibers created a fine white dust that hung in the air like fog, getting into your nose, throat, lungs, and eventually your eternal soul. The machine oil, used to keep the hundreds of mechanical parts moving, added an acrid note to the atmosphere. And the sweat, because 100 workers in high heat and humidity tend to sweat, added the final note to this symphony of industrial odors. Thomas made his way to his station, loom number 47, which he'd been operating for the past 6 years. Before that, he'd been a piecer, the job given to children and new workers, which involved crawling under running machines to tie broken threads together, a task that combined the danger of cave diving with the excitement of playing chicken with industrial equipment. His loom was a power loom, a mechanical marvel that had revolutionized textile production and revolutionarily increased the rate at which workers got injured. It stood about 7 feet tall and 12 feet wide, a framework of wood and metal that weaved cotton thread into fabric, with the efficiency of a sewing machine operated by a caffeinated giant. The loom was already running. The mill had started operations at 4:30, powered by a massive steam engine in the basement that drove a complex system of belts, shafts, and pulleys that transferred power to each individual machine. The system was brilliant, efficient, and occasionally liked to catch workers' clothing and drag them into the machinery, which is why most factory workers had a story about someone they knew who'd been caught by the belting. Thomas's job was to monitor the loom, watch for broken threads, make minor adjustments, and generally ensure that the machine continued turning cotton into fabric, and not turning itself into a mechanical disaster. It required constant attention because the machines were temperamental, prone to jams, breaks, and occasional acts of mechanical violence. He'd been standing at his station for approximately 5 minutes when Mr. Grimshaw himself made an appearance. Jonathan Grimshaw was the mill owner, a man who had inherited the business from his father and ran it with the compassionate understanding of someone who viewed workers as slightly more valuable than the cotton they processed, but less valuable than the machines they operated. Grimshaw was 53. Well, fed in a way that marked him as wealthy, because obesity in Victorian England was a sign of prosperity, while starvation was a sign of employment. He wore a fine wool suit that cost more than Thomas would make in 5 years, and he carried a walking stick that had never been used for walking, but had definitely been used for gesturing at workers aggressively. "Gentlemen," Grimshaw shouted over the noise of the looms, though his voice barely carried, "I expect maximum productivity today. I've received a large order from London, and I'll not have laziness affecting our output. Anyone caught slacking will be dismissed immediately." This was a lie. Grimshaw gave this speech approximately twice a week. There was no large order. There was never a large order, but the threat of dismissal kept workers moving at maximum speed, which improved productivity and gave Grimshaw a sense of power that compensated for the fact that his wife found him boring and his children actively avoided him. The overseer, Blackburn, circulated through the floor, watching for any sign of reduced effort. He carried a leather strap, not officially for hitting workers, because that would be illegal according to the Factory Act of 1833, but definitely useful for encouraging proper posture and attention, which was definitely not hitting workers, just aggressively motivating them through percussive maintenance. Thomas focused on his loom. The work was mind, numbing in its repetitiveness, but required constant attention. The threads had to be watched. The tension had to be monitored. The shuttle, which flew back and forth at high speed, weaving the threads together, occasionally jammed and needed to be cleared quickly before the machine damaged itself. The first hour passed like a decade. Time in the factory moved differently than time in the outside world. Einstein would later prove that time was relative, but factory workers had already figured this out through empirical experience. An hour at home felt like 10 minutes. An hour in the factory felt like you'd aged 10 years. Around 6 o'clock, William appeared. Thomas's 9-year-old son had arrived for his shift as a scavenger, one of the jobs given to children, because adults were too large to fit under the running machines. William's job was to crawl beneath the looms while they were operating and collect the waste cotton that fell through the frames, a task that was incredibly dangerous, borderline insane, and absolutely normal for Victorian England. Thomas felt the familiar twist in his stomach every time he saw his son crawl under the machinery. He'd seen children caught by the belting. He'd seen fingers crushed in gears. He'd seen worse, but dwelling on worse made it impossible to continue working, and not working meant starvation, so he didn't dwell. William waved at his father and disappeared under Thomas's loom, a small figure vanishing into the forest of mechanical parts and moving belts. The boy was quick and careful. But quick and careful could still get you killed when you were working inches from machinery that didn't care about human life. The morning continued its slow march toward breakfast break, which was scheduled for 8 o'clock and lasted exactly 15 minutes. This wasn't a legal requirement. The Factory Act of 1833 didn't mandate breaks. Grimshaw provided the break because he'd discovered that workers who didn't eat occasionally tended to faint and fall into machinery, which damaged the machines and reduced productivity. At 8, the steam engine was powered down, the belt stopped moving, and the looms gradually ground to a halt. The sudden silence was almost painful after hours of mechanical noise. Workers' ears rang. Conversations happened in shouts, because no one could hear properly anymore. Thomas retrieved his breakfast from the small bag he'd brought. Another piece of bread, some cheese that was more optimism than dairy, and an onion. This was standard working class breakfast. The bread provided calories. The cheese provided protein, if you used the term very loosely. The onion provided flavor and the sense that you were eating an actual meal rather than just consuming fuel. He sat on the floor because there were no chairs and found William, who'd emerged from under the looms covered in cotton fiber and machine oil, looking like a small ghost who'd been in a fight with a mechanical spider. "How's your morning, lad?" Thomas asked, though he could see the exhaustion in his son's eyes. "Tired, da. But Mr. Blackburn says I'm doing well. Says maybe in a few years I can be a piecer instead of a scavenger." Thomas didn't have the heart to tell his son that being a piecer was marginally more dangerous than being a scavenger and only slightly less degrading. Instead, he nodded and shared his onion, because if you couldn't give your children a better life, you could at least give them part of your onion. Around them, other workers ate their meager meals. Conversations were muted. Everyone was too tired to socialize properly. Some workers coughed. The wet, hacking sound that suggested their lungs were no longer functional organs, but decorative meat sacks filled with cotton fiber. A few workers slept, using the 15 minutes to catch unconsciousness before the machine started again. One worker, James Holbrook, had recently lost 2 fingers to a loom malfunction. He sat alone, staring at his bandaged hand with the expression of someone doing mental arithmetic about how he'd continue working with 8 fingers instead of 10, and how his already minimal wages would be reduced now that he was technically disabled. The factory didn't provide compensation for injuries. There was no workers' compensation system. If you got hurt, you either worked through it, or you were dismissed and replaced by one of the thousands of desperate people who needed any job, even one that might kill them. Mrs. Patterson, one of the few women working in the weaving room, sat with her daughter, Emily, who was 7 and worked as a scavenger like William. Mrs. Patterson's husband had died in a factory accident 3 years ago, caught by the belting and dragged into the drive shaft, an accident that had been ruled misadventure by the coroner and resulted in exactly 0 changes to factory safety procedures. The whistle blew, signaling the end of breakfast. Workers groaned collectively, a sound that expressed 15 different emotions, none of them positive. They returned to their stations. The steam engine powered up with a great huffing and hissing. The belts began moving. The looms started their thunderous operation, and the day continued. By 10 o'clock, Thomas's feet ached. Standing in one place for hours was surprisingly more painful than walking. His legs throbbed. His back complained. His hands, permanently cramped from years of operating machinery, protested every movement. The heat had become oppressive. The combination of body heat from workers, the steam engine, and the deliberate humidity made breathing feel like drinking hot soup through your lungs. Sweat poured down everyone's faces, soaking through clothing, making the air smell like a gymnasium that had never been cleaned. The noise had become background static. After hours of exposure, the human brain started filtering it out, which was helpful for sanity, but dangerous for safety because you couldn't hear warning sounds when everything was a warning sound. Around 11, there was an accident. A young worker named Peter, 16 years old and new to the factory, got his sleeve caught in his loom's drive belt. The belt, moving at high speed, dragged his arm into the pulley system. His scream was barely audible over the machinery noise, but workers near him noticed and began shouting. Mr. Blackburn rushed over and pulled the emergency stop lever for Peter's section, which powered down 6 looms including Thomas's. The sudden quiet revealed Peter's continued screaming. His arm was mangled, caught between the belt and pulley, crushed and twisted in ways arms weren't designed to twist. Blood was everywhere. Arterial spray painting the loom, red in a pattern that looked almost artistic if you ignored the human suffering it represented. 2 workers pulled Peter free, his arm coming loose with sounds that would haunt their dreams. Mr. Blackburn shouted for someone to fetch the factory surgeon, a man named Dr. Pemberton, who was less a doctor and more a butcher with medical aspirations. Pemberton arrived within minutes, carrying his bag of tools that looked suspiciously like carpentry equipment. He examined Peter's arm, which was hanging by tendons and looked like ground meat that had been processed by an angry machine, which it had been. "It'll have to come off," Pemberton announced. The same diagnosis he gave approximately once a week, because Victorian factory medicine was less about healing and more about preventing people from dying of infections caused by massive trauma. They carried Peter to the surgery room, which was a small office on the ground floor containing a table, some leather straps to hold down screaming patients, a saw, and a bottle of whiskey that served as anesthesia, antiseptic, and payment for Dr. Pemberton's services. The looms in Peter's section remained stopped for exactly 20 minutes, while his blood was cleaned up and the belting was checked for damage. The workers in that section stood idle, which meant they wouldn't be paid for those 20 minutes, because payment was by production. And standing around watching a colleague get dismembered didn't count as production. Mr. Grimshaw appeared, surveyed the scene, frowned at the lost productivity, and ordered the looms restarted. He didn't visit Peter in the surgery room. He didn't express sympathy. He made a mental note to hire a replacement because a one-armed worker was less productive than a two-armed worker, and Peter would likely be dismissed once he recovered from the amputation, assuming he survived the inevitable infection that followed Victorian surgery. The machine started again. The noise resumed. Work continued. Several workers vomited from the stress and smell of blood, but they vomited into buckets provided for this exact purpose and kept working because stopping meant dismissal. Thomas had seen this before. He'd see it again. Factory accidents were as much a part of industrial life as wages and exhaustion. The machines didn't care about human fragility. The owners cared about productivity. The workers cared about survival. These three facts rarely aligned in ways that benefited the workers. William had witnessed the accident from under the looms, his small face pale with shock. Thomas caught his eye and gave him what he hoped was a reassuring look, though reassurance was difficult when your workplace regularly dismembered people. Lunch break arrived at noon, another 15-minute respite that felt simultaneously too short and desperately needed. Thomas's lunch was identical to breakfast because variety required money and imagination, and he had neither. More bread, more cheese. The onion was finished, sacrificed to his son's hunger during breakfast. The workers ate in exhausted silence, too tired even for the dark humor that usually accompanied factory life. The accident had dampened spirits, a reminder that every day at the mill could be your last day, with all your limbs attached. Mary had sent a small piece of bacon wrapped in cloth, a luxury saved from Sunday's dinner. Thomas split it with William, the fatty meat tasting like heaven after hours of bread and disappointment. The salt was almost overwhelming, a burst of flavor in the bland monotony of factory worker diet. "I don't want to be a pizza, duh," William said quietly, chewing his bacon. Thomas didn't know what to say. The truth was that William didn't have a choice. The family needed his wages, small as they were. Children working in factories wasn't ideal, but neither was starvation, and those were the two options available to working-class families in industrial England. "You'll be careful," Thomas said instead. "You'll watch the machines. You'll keep your attention sharp. And you'll grow up to do something better than this." It was a lie. They both knew it. William would likely spend his entire life in factories, just like his father, just like his grandfather. Social mobility in Victorian England was a theoretical concept discussed by political philosophers and experienced by approximately no one in the working class. The whistle blew. Back to work. The afternoon shift was somehow worse than the morning because exhaustion had accumulated, and the day's end was still hours away. The heat intensified. The humidity increased. The air became soupy, almost liquid. Workers wiped sweat from their eyes constantly. Some developed heat exhaustion, swaying at their stations, but kept working because collapsing meant potential dismissal. Around 2 o'clock, Thomas's loom developed a problem. The shuttle mechanism jammed, probably because a thread had gotten caught in the gearing. He pulled the stop lever for his individual machine, a move that would cost him wages for every minute the machine wasn't producing, but was necessary to prevent worse damage. He opened the shuttle box and began the delicate work of clearing the jam. His fingers, thick from years of labor and clumsy from exhaustion, struggled with the fine threads. The cotton fibers had wrapped around the small gears that drove the shuttle, creating a tangle that required patience and precision. Mr. Blackburn appeared, as he always did when machines stopped. "Blackwell, why is your loom not running?" "Jammed shuttle, sir." "I'm clearing it now. Clear it faster." "Every minute this machine is idle costs, Mr. Grimshaw money." Thomas wanted to point out that every minute also cost him wages, but antagonizing the overseer was a quick path to unemployment. He worked faster, his fingers fumbling with the delicate mechanism. The jam cleared, he restarted the loom, and production resumed. The incident had cost him approximately 10 minutes, which represented a small but significant portion of his daily wages. At the end of the week, that 10 minutes might mean the difference between buying enough food and going hungry. The afternoon crawled forward with the enthusiasm of a snail with depression. 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. The factory day was 12 hours, starting at 5 in the morning and ending at 5 in the evening, with the 2 15-minute breaks providing 30 minutes of non-work time, which meant 11.5 hours of actual labor. This was actually an improvement. Before the Factory Act of 1833, shifts were often 14 or 16 hours, with children working the same hours as adults. The Act had limited children under 18 to 12 hours, and had mandated that children receive 2 hours of education per day. A revolutionary concept that suggested maybe children should learn to read instead of exclusively learning how to operate machinery. Of course, the education requirement was barely enforced, and many factory owners simply ignored it or provided education that consisted of someone barely literate reading Bible verses while children sat exhausted after 8 hours of manual labor. By 5 o'clock, Thomas was running on fumes. His body ached everywhere. His feet felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who'd been beaten with hammers. His hands cramped, his eyes burned from the cotton dust. His lungs felt tight, each breath an effort. The whistle blew, signaling the end of the shift. The steam engine powered down. The belts stopped. The looms ground to a halt. The sudden silence was almost painful. A void where the noise had been. Workers filed out slowly, moving with the enthusiasm of the elderly despite many being in their 20s. Thomas collected William, who looked like he'd been dragged behind a horse, and they joined the exodus. Outside, the Manchester evening was beginning. The sun was setting, creating a spectacular orange glow through the factory smoke, turning the industrial hellscape into something almost beautiful if you squinted and ignored the choking air quality. The walk home took 30 minutes because exhaustion slowed everyone down. Thomas and William walked in silence, too tired for conversation. Around them, other workers shuffled toward their various tenements, a slow, moving river of industrial casualties. They passed a public house, the Engineers' Arms, where some workers stopped despite having almost no money because alcohol provided temporary relief from the crushing reality of their existence. Thomas understood the appeal, but kept walking. Mary would have dinner prepared, such as it was, and spending money on Al meant less money for food. Home was exactly as they'd left it 12 hours ago, except now it contained Mary and the other 2 children, plus the ever-present rats who had apparently spent their day doing rat things, which mostly involved being rats. Mary had prepared dinner, a feat of culinary magic given their budget. Potato soup, made by boiling potatoes with water, onions, and prayer. Bread from yesterday, toasted to hide its staleness. And tea, weak enough to be transparent, because tea leaves were expensive and had to be reused multiple times before being discarded. The family ate in silence, sitting on the floor because they owned exactly 2 chairs and 6 people. The soup was watery and bland but hot, which was something. The bread was carbohydrate. The tea was liquid. Together, they formed a meal in the loosest possible definition of the term. Thomas's mother-in-law Agnes complained about her arthritis, which was understandable given she was 53 and had spent 40 years working in various factories before her hands became too gnarled to operate machinery effectively. She now did piecework at home, sewing garments for a local clothing manufacturer, earning approximately a third of what Thomas made, but at least working in relative comfort. After dinner, there was approximately 1 hour before everyone had to sleep to be ready for tomorrow's shift. Thomas spent it checking the family's finances, which was a depressing exercise that involved counting pennies and doing math that never worked out in their favour. His weekly wage was 8 shillings, which sounds like a lot until you factor in the costs of living in Victorian Manchester. Rent for their single room was 2 shillings per week. Food cost approximately 4 shillings if they were careful, and ate mostly bread and potatoes. Coal for heating and cooking was 1 shilling. This left 1 shilling for everything else: clothing, soap, candles, unexpected expenses, and the constant fear that any minor emergency would bankrupt them. William's wages as a scavenger added 2 shillings per week, which was both essential to the family's survival and deeply depressing because they were dependent on a 9-year-old's labour to avoid starvation. Mary's washing work brought in 3 shillings per week, though the work destroyed her hands and back. She washed clothing for middle-class families, scrubbing by hand with lye soap that ate away at her skin, leaving her hands red, cracked and painful. Together, the family earned 13 shillings per week. After expenses, they had approximately 2 shillings remaining for everything else. This meant that any major expense, illness, accident, or bad luck would immediately push them into debt. And debt in Victorian England was a spiral that ended in the workhouse, which was essentially prison for the poor. The workhouse was every working-class family's nightmare. Run by the government under the Poor Law, workhouses were designed to be so unpleasant that people would do anything to avoid them. Families were separated by gender and age. The work was hard labour. The food was minimal. The conditions were deliberately harsh to discourage people from seeking help. Thomas had a cousin who'd ended up in the workhouse after her husband died, and she couldn't support their 4 children alone. He'd visited once. Once was enough. The place had been a Victorian horror show of deliberate suffering, designed to punish people for the crime of being poor. He shook off the dark thoughts and focused on the present. William was falling asleep sitting up, a skill developed by children who worked 12-hour shifts. The 2 younger children, Charlotte and Edward, had already collapsed into bed, which was a pile of straw and blankets on the floor. Mary was mending clothing by candlelight, her hands moving mechanically despite the pain. Agnes was already asleep, snoring with the enthusiasm of someone who'd earned their exhaustion over decades. Thomas extinguished the candle to save money and joined Mary on the mattress. The room was dark except for moonlight through the single window. The sounds of the tenement surrounded them: babies crying, couples arguing, someone coughing the distinctive wet hack of tuberculosis, the rats scratching in the walls. Another day survived, Mary whispered, her standard evening comment. Another day survived, Thomas agreed. They slept, and 8 hours later, the factory bell rang again. Tuesday was identical to Monday in every way that mattered. The same wake-up time, the same walk through darkness, the same 12 hours of mechanical thunder, the same exhaustion, the same hunger, the same survival. Wednesday brought excitement in the form of Mr. Grimshaw announcing he was reducing wages by 10% due to increased competition and market pressures, which was factory owner code for "I want a new carriage and workers are expensive." The workers were devastated. A 10% wage reduction meant Thomas would go from 8 shillings to 7 shillings and 2 pence per week. That missing 10 pence represented meals. That missing 10 pence represented the margin between survival and disaster. Some workers muttered about striking, but strikes in 1842 were dangerous propositions. The Combination Acts had been repealed in 1824, making unions theoretically legal, but in practice, striking workers were often dismissed and blacklisted, making it impossible to find work anywhere. Additionally, strikes required savings to survive the lost wages, and workers living paycheck to paycheck had no savings. A delegation of workers approached Mr. Blackburn to request he speak with Mr. Grimshaw about reconsidering the wage reduction. Blackburn listened with the expression of someone hearing a particularly boring ghost story, and informed them that the decision was final, and anyone refusing to work at the new wage would be dismissed immediately. The workers returned to their looms. What choice did they have? Starve now by striking, or starve slowly while working? The math was simple even if the situation was depressing. Thursday brought rain, which transformed Manchester's unpaved streets into rivers of mud mixed with horse manure and human waste, creating a substance that was less terrain and more biological hazard. Thomas's walk to the factory involved wading through ankle-deep filth, which soaked through his boots, despite the multiple layers of cloth he'd wrapped around them. Wet clothing in the factory was miserable. The humidity that was already oppressive became suffocating when combined with soaked garments. Thomas worked his 12-hour shift feeling like he'd been dipped in bathwater and then forced to stand in a sauna while operating heavy machinery. Several workers developed coughs by the end of the day, the beginning of respiratory infections that would either pass or progress to pneumonia, which was a leading cause of death among factory workers because modern antibiotics wouldn't be invented for another century. Friday was payday, which should have been celebratory, but was mostly just a reminder of how little they earned and how much they needed. Workers lined up at Mr. Blackburn's desk where he distributed wages in coins, carefully counting out each person's earnings, while making comments about productivity and effort. Thomas received his reduced wage of 7 shillings and 2 pence. Now missing both the wage reduction and several penalties for imaginary lateness, and the time his loom had been stopped for mechanical issues, his actual take home was 6 shillings and 8 pence. He felt the coins in his hand, heavy and insufficient. This money represented 60 hours of labour, the risk of injury and death, the sacrifice of his childhood and his son's childhood, and it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Some workers immediately headed to the public house, converting their wages into alcohol with impressive efficiency. Thomas understood the appeal of oblivion, but had mouths to feed. He went home. The weekend was 2 half-days, Saturday afternoon and Sunday, because even Victorian factory owners recognized that humans required some rest, though they minimized it as much as legally possible. Saturday's shift ended at 2 o'clock instead of 5, a luxury that felt almost decadent. Thomas spent Saturday afternoon attempting to repair their living space, which was a constant battle against decay. The walls needed patching where damp had crumbled the plaster. The window frame had rotted and needed stuffing with rags to keep out the wind. The door hung crooked on its hinges, a problem he'd been meaning to fix for months, but lacked the tools, materials, and energy to address. He worked with the methodical exhaustion of someone too tired to work, but too poor to stop. Mary washed their clothing in a communal courtyard tub, scrubbing with harsh soap that left her hands bleeding. The children played in the streets, which was less, played, and more, avoided getting hit by horses while breathing polluted air. Sunday was theoretically a day of rest, which meant they rested by going to church, because not attending church meant social ostracism and potential employment problems, since factory owners preferred workers who demonstrated proper Christian values like obedience, submission, and not complaining about working conditions. The church, St. Mark's, was a Gothic structure that had been beautiful once, but had been overwhelmed by the industrial expansion of Manchester. Soot covered its stone walls, turning them from grey to black, The stained glass windows, depicting various biblical scenes, were barely visible through decades of accumulated grime. The service was conducted by Reverend Thornbury, a well-meaning man who genuinely cared about his working-class congregation, but whose sermons often included themes like, "Blessed are the poor," and "The meek shall inherit the earth," which were nice concepts but didn't pay rent or buy food. He preached about endurance, faith, and the rewards that awaited the righteous in heaven, a message that was either deeply comforting or deeply depressing, depending on your theological perspective. Thomas sat in the hard wooden pew, fighting to stay awake despite the Reverend's passionate delivery. Around him, other factory workers did the same, their bodies automatically responding to any opportunity to rest by attempting to lose consciousness. After the service, there was a brief social period where parishioners mingled. This was where working-class families maintained their social networks, shared information about job openings, and collectively complained about their circumstances in ways that wouldn't get them fired. Thomas spoke with James Holbrook, the man who'd lost 2 fingers the previous week. The amputation had been successful in that James hadn't died of infection yet, but unsuccessful in that he'd been dismissed from Grimshaw's mill for reduced productivity. He was now looking for work that didn't require 10 fingers, which was challenging because most jobs in industrial Manchester assumed you came with all your original body parts. Thinking of trying the docks, James said, his bandaged hand tucked into his coat. They take men with injuries sometimes. Loading work, heavy lifting. Thomas nodded sympathetically. The docks paid slightly better than factories, but were even more dangerous, with workers regularly crushed by cargo, drowned falling into the water, or injured by the heavy equipment used to load and unload ships. It was a choice between different types of industrial death. Mrs. Patterson was there with her daughter Emily, both looking more exhausted than usual. She'd been taking extra washing work to compensate for reduced factory wages, which meant she was now working approximately 18 hours per day between the factory and the laundry. A schedule that was slowly killing her, but slightly less quickly than starvation would. "How are you managing with the wage reduction?" she asked Thomas quietly. "Barely," he admitted. "Cut back on food. Trying to make do." She nodded. "Same. Emily's getting thinner. I don't know how much more we can cut before..." She trailed off, not finishing the sentence, because finishing it would make the fear too real. The conversation was interrupted by Reverend Thornbury, who approached with his characteristic enthusiasm for trying to help people he didn't actually have the resources to help.
"Thomas! Mrs. Patterson!"
"How are we this fine Sunday?" "Surviving, Reverend," Thomas said, which was his standard response to that question.
"Wonderful."
"The Lord provides, does he not?" Thornbury beamed, apparently unaware that the Lord's provision mostly consisted of letting them continue their miserable existences without immediate death. "Indeed, Reverend," Mrs. Patterson said, with the practiced politeness of someone who couldn't afford to be honest. Thornbury lowered his voice conspiratorially. "I wanted you both to know that the parish has received a small donation from a charitable society. We're organising a distribution of food parcels next week for families in need. Nothing substantial, mind you, but perhaps a few extra potatoes and some bread. I thought you might be interested." Thomas and Mrs. Patterson both nodded eagerly. Charity was humiliating, but hunger was worse. Pride was a luxury reserved for people who weren't slowly starving. "Thank you, Reverend. That's very kind," Thomas said.
"Not at all! We must care for our flock!"
"Though I must say," Thornbury continued, shifting into what Thomas recognized as his moral lecture tone, "these difficulties can be overcome with proper Christian virtue. Temperance, especially. I notice some of our parishioners spending their wages on drink rather than necessities. A sober, God-fearing worker can provide for his family if he manages his resources properly." Thomas resisted the urge to point out that no amount of sobriety and resource management could stretch 6 shillings and 8 into enough money to feed a family of 6 plus one mother. In-law while paying rent and buying coal. Instead, he nodded and thanked the Reverend again. The walk home from church took them past the middle-class neighborhoods, where houses had multiple rooms and gardens and windows that weren't broken. Children played in the streets wearing shoes without holes. Women walked past wearing dresses that weren't made from repaired potato sacks. Men stood on corners discussing politics and business, their bellies full and their futures secure. The contrast was stark. Victorian England was experiencing unprecedented economic growth, but that growth had created a society split between those who owned the factories and those who worked in them, with very little middle ground. Sunday afternoon was spent in quiet desperation. The family ate their main meal, which was marginally better than weekday meals, because Sunday dinner was a working-class tradition that suggested maybe once a week you could eat something that wasn't just bread and potatoes. Mary had prepared a small piece of mutton purchased from the butcher for 3 pence, which represented a significant portion of their weekly budget, but was justified as a Sunday luxury. She'd boiled it with vegetables into a stew that fed all 7 of them, though the portions were small and the mutton was more conceptual than substantial. The meal was eaten in silence, everyone savouring the rare taste of meat. Even the children, usually restless and noisy, ate quietly, understanding at some instinctive level that this meal was special and should be appreciated. After dinner, Thomas had a few hours before bedtime. He spent them attempting to teach William to read, using a tattered Bible borrowed from the church and his own limited literacy skills. Thomas had learned to read as a child, before factory work had consumed his life, though his education had been minimal and his reading ability was basic. William struggled with the letters, his young mind exhausted from 6 days of factory work and not naturally inclined toward academics. But Thomas persisted because literacy was one of the few paths to potential advancement. If William could read and write well enough, he might eventually get a clerical job, something that didn't involve machinery and death. The cat sat on the... William read slowly, pointing at each word. Keep going. Mat. The cat sat on the mat. It wasn't much, but it was something. A tiny rebellion against the industrial system that wanted to consume William entirely, turning him into nothing more than a human tool for operating machinery. Agnes sat in the corner, mending clothing by the last rays of sunlight because candles cost money. Her hands moved automatically, decades of muscle memory guiding her needle through fabric. She hummed quietly, an old song from her childhood, back when Manchester had been a market town instead of an industrial nightmare. Mary sat with Charlotte and Edward, telling them stories because story-telling was free entertainment, and working-class families had very little money for actual entertainment. She spoke of fairy tales and magical kingdoms, places where poor children could become princes, where hard work was rewarded, where happy endings existed. The children listened with rapt attention, their imaginations temporarily escaping their one-room tenement. For a moment, they weren't factory workers' children destined for poverty. They were adventurers, heroes, people with futures that involved more than just survival. As the sun set, the family prepared for bed. Tomorrow was Monday again. The cycle would repeat. The factory would open. The machines would run. The work would continue. Thomas lay in the darkness, listening to his family breathe. Mary beside him. William curled against his back. Charlotte and Edward in their pile of straw and blankets. Agnes snoring softly. The rats scratching in the walls. He thought about the future, which was a mistake, because the future looked exactly like the present, stretching forward endlessly. William would work in factories. Charlotte and Edward would join him when they were old enough. They'd all struggle to survive. Some would die young from accidents or disease. The survivors would age prematurely, their bodies broken by industrial labor. There was no escape, no social mobility, no prospect of improvement. The system was designed to keep workers working, to extract maximum labor for minimum wages, to ensure that the factory owners grew wealthy while the workers remained desperately poor. But dwelling on this reality made it impossible to continue. And continuing was necessary because the alternative was starvation or the workhouse. So Thomas pushed the thoughts away, closed his eyes, and tried to sleep. Monday arrived again, announced by the factory bell, a sound that Thomas had begun to hate with a passion that surprised him. He'd never been a hateful person. Anger required energy he couldn't spare. But that bell, ringing at 4:30 in the morning, summoning him to another day of mechanical slavery, had become a focus for all his accumulated resentment. The week progressed in its familiar rhythm of misery. Tuesday was identical to Monday. Wednesday brought a small variation when one of the steam engine's belts snapped, causing a work stoppage that lasted 3 hours while the engineers replaced it. The workers were not paid for these 3 hours because they hadn't been producing anything, turning an equipment failure into a wage reduction. Thursday saw another accident. A young woman named Sarah, working as a piecer, got her hair caught in the loom mechanism. She'd been wearing it loose, which violated factory rules, but was understandable because the heat made wearing it up uncomfortable. The machine caught her hair and dragged her forward, slamming her head repeatedly against the wooden frame before someone could stop the machine. She survived, but with a fractured skull and significant brain injury. Dr. Pemberton examined her, declared there was nothing to be done beyond rest and prayer, and she was carried home by her family. She'd likely never work again, and her family would have to survive without her wages, pushing them closer to destitution. Mr. Grimshaw used the incident to announce a new strict enforcement of hair regulations, threatening dismissal for anyone whose hair wasn't properly secured. He did not announce any investigation into whether the machine safety guards, which were supposed to prevent exactly this type of accident, had been properly maintained. He did not discuss whether production speeds were too high. He did not question whether exhausted workers could reasonably be expected to maintain perfect attention for 12-hour shifts. Instead, he blamed Sarah for her own injury, a standard factory owner response that shifted responsibility from dangerous working conditions to worker carelessness. Friday's payday brought more disappointment. Thomas's wages, already reduced, were further diminished by penalties for the machine stoppage on Wednesday. Even though the stoppage had been caused by equipment failure rather than anything he'd done, his take home was 6 shillings and 2 pence, 6 pence less than the previous week. He stared at the coins in his hand with mounting desperation. This wasn't enough. Even with William's wages and Mary's laundry income, they were falling behind. The rent was due. Food prices had increased slightly. They were consuming their margin of survival. That weekend, Thomas made a difficult decision. He would seek additional work. Some factories ran night shifts. Some required workers on Sundays despite religious objections. If he could find another 4 or 5 hours of work per week, that might generate an extra shilling or 2. He spent Saturday afternoon walking through the factory district, inquiring about work. The first 3 mills turned him away. They had no openings, or the openings they had were for skilled workers, or they wanted younger men who weren't already exhausted from 60 hours of weekly labor. The 4th mill, Blackstone's Ironworks, was hiring for a Sunday morning shift, 5 hours of work for 18 pence. The work involved moving raw iron ore from storage to the furnaces. Heavy labor that would destroy his back, but would pay. Thomas accepted immediately. His new schedule meant he worked Monday through Saturday at Grimshaw's mill, 12 hours per day. Then Sunday morning at Blackstone's Ironworks for 5 hours. This gave him exactly Sunday afternoon free. Approximately 4 hours per week when he wasn't working. The added wages helped. 18 pence per week was significant. But the physical toll was immediate and severe. Thomas was now working 77 hours per week, his body operating on minimal sleep and inadequate nutrition. He began losing weight. His face became gaunt. His eyes developed dark circles that made him look like a corpse that had forgotten to die. His hands shook from exhaustion. His thinking became foggy, his mind struggling to process basic information. Mary begged him to quit the Sunday work. "You're killing yourself," she said, her voice full of fear and love. "We need the money," he replied, which was true but incomplete. The complete truth was that he was trading his health, and probably years of his life, for an extra 18 pence per week. And he knew this trade was terrible, but didn't see any alternative. The weeks blurred together. October became November. The weather turned cold, which transformed the factory from a humid hell into a humid, freezing hell, because the buildings weren't heated beyond the natural warmth generated by the steam engines and human bodies. Workers wore multiple layers of clothing, which made them look bulkier and made the heat periods even more unbearable. Thomas wore 2 shirts, a vest, and a coat while working, sweating through all of them during the day and freezing in them at night during the walk home. The cold brought increased sickness. Respiratory infections spread through the tenement like wildfire. The combination of malnutrition, exhaustion, poor ventilation, and multiple families living in close quarters created perfect conditions for disease transmission. Charlotte developed a cough that wouldn't go away. Mary tried home remedies, honey and lemon when they could afford it, steam treatments using heated water, extra rest. But Charlotte continued working because her scavenging wages were necessary, and resting meant lost income. The cough worsened. By mid-November, Charlotte was coughing up blood, the distinctive symptom of tuberculosis, the disease that killed approximately 1/3 of all working-class people in Victorian England. Thomas and Mary took her to the charitable hospital, a grim building that provided free medical care to the poor, which meant substandard care, but it was better than no care. The doctor, a young man doing his required service to the poor before moving to a private practice treating wealthy patients, examined Charlotte and confirmed what they'd feared: tuberculosis, advanced stage. Her lungs are severely damaged. "Can you treat it?" Mary asked, her voice breaking. "There is no treatment. Rest, fresh air, good nutrition. These might slow the progression." But he trailed off, not needing to complete the sentence. Charlotte was 7 years old. She had tuberculosis. She would likely be dead within a year. The doctor provided some laudanum for pain and told them to keep her comfortable. Comfort wasn't free, but dying children deserved whatever comfort their parents could provide. They took Charlotte home and laid her in the bed. She was too sick to work now, which meant losing her scavenging wages, but that hardly mattered compared to watching your child die slowly. Thomas felt something break inside himself. He'd endured poverty, exhaustion, exploitation, and degradation. But watching his 7-year-old daughter struggle to breathe, knowing that the factory dust she'd been breathing for 2 years had destroyed her lungs, knowing that his poverty had killed her because wealthier children didn't work in factories and didn't get tuberculosis, this was beyond endurance. He continued working because stopping meant the entire family would starve, and Charlotte's death didn't justify additional deaths. But something in him had changed. The passive acceptance of his circumstances, the grinding submission to industrial exploitation, had transformed into a cold anger that burned in his chest like a coal forge. At the factory, he began talking with other workers about conditions. Not loudly or publicly, which would attract attention from the overseers, but quietly during the brief breaks, in whispers that wouldn't carry. Were being killed for their profits, he said to James Holbrook, who'd found work at the docks and visited on Saturday afternoons. "Everyone knows that," James replied. "Knowing it doesn't change it. Maybe if enough of us refused to accept it, things would change." "Refused how?" "Strike. You know what happens to strikers. Dismissed, blacklisted, starved. Maybe starving while fighting is better than starving while submitting." James shook his head. "You're talking revolution, Thomas. That's dangerous thinking." And it was dangerous thinking. Victorian England didn't tolerate workers who questioned the social order. The Peterloo Massacre of 1819 had shown what happened when workers demanded rights cavalry charges, deaths, arrests. The system was designed to keep workers powerless, divided, and desperate. But Thomas couldn't shake the anger. Every day at the factory, watching the machines run, seeing other workers injured or killed, knowing that Charlotte was dying at home while Mr. Grimshaw grew wealthier, fed the flame. He began attending meetings of the Chartist movement, a political organization demanding voting rights for working class men. The movement was growing, driven by workers who recognized that without political power, they had no ability to change their circumstances. The meetings were held in secret, in basements and back rooms, because publicly advocating for working class political rights was considered seditious. Thomas attended with several other Grimshaw workers, listening to speakers describe a future where workers could vote, where Parliament represented ordinary people instead of just property owners, where laws protected workers instead of exploiting them. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. The ideas challenged everything Thomas had been taught about his place in society. The Anglican Church preached acceptance and submission. Factory owners insisted that workers should be grateful for employment. Society as a whole maintained that the rich deserved their wealth and the poor deserved their poverty because of some moral calculation involving hard work and virtue. But the Chartist speakers, many of them educated workers or sympathetic middle-class reformers, presented a different narrative. They argued that the working class created the wealth that enriched factory owners. They pointed out that workers had no voice in the political system that created the laws governing their lives. They demanded universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and payment for members of Parliament so that working class men could serve. Thomas found himself nodding along, his anger crystallizing into political consciousness. The system wasn't natural or inevitable. It was constructed, maintained by laws and violence, designed to benefit owners at the expense of workers. But consciousness didn't pay rent or feed his family. He continued working his 77 hours per week, his body slowly breaking down under the strain. December arrived, bringing bitter cold and the Christmas season. Christmas in Victorian England was a complicated affair for the working class. The wealthy celebrated with elaborate dinners, gifts, and days off. The working class got Christmas Day off, unpaid, and were expected to be grateful for the opportunity to spend a single day with their families while earning nothing. Mr. Grimshaw, in a display of holiday generosity, announced that workers would receive a special Christmas bonus, a full day off on Christmas Day, plus an extra half day on Christmas Eve, and a bonus payment of 1 shilling per worker. The workers received this announcement with mixed emotions. The day off was nice, but unpaid days off meant lost wages when they could least afford it. The bonus of 1 shilling was something, but it barely compensated for the lost wages from the unpaid time off. Still, Christmas Day provided a break from the relentless factory rhythm. Thomas spent it at home with his family, trying to create something resembling celebration despite their circumstances. Mary had saved pennies for weeks, purchasing special food for Christmas dinner: a small chicken, expensive but traditional, potatoes, carrots, bread, even a small pudding made with dried fruit, a luxury that cost 2 pence but made the children's eyes light up. Charlotte sat propped against the wall, too weak to sit unsupported. Her cough had become constant, a wet rattling sound that filled the room. But she smiled when she saw the special food, and for a moment, she looked like a child instead of a dying patient. The family ate together, a rare occurrence since their schedules rarely aligned. Thomas said a prayer, thanking God for the food, and asking him to watch over Charlotte, though he wasn't sure he believed in a God who would let 7-year-olds die of industrial disease. After dinner, they sang carols, their voices thin and tired but earnest. Silent night, hark the herald angels sing, songs about peace and joy and divine love. sung in a tenement room that smelled of damp and disease. The children received gifts, small toys Thomas had carved from scrap wood during his few free hours. A doll for Charlotte, a horse for Edward, a boat for William. Simple things, roughly made, but treasured because gifts of any kind were rare. Mary had knitted new socks for Thomas. Using wool she'd saved thread by thread from her laundry work. He put them on immediately, feeling the warmth and love woven into every stitch. For a few hours, they were a family rather than an economic unit struggling to survive. They laughed. They told stories. They pretended that their lives were normal and happy, instead of desperate and grinding. But night came, as it always did, and with it the return of reality. Charlotte's coughing worsened. Mary tended to her through the night, administering laudanum to ease the pain, holding her daughter as she struggled to breathe. Thomas lay awake, listening to his daughter fight for air, feeling helpless and enraged. This was what the Industrial Revolution had created, a system so efficient at producing textiles that it killed children in the process, and so profitable for owners that they had no incentive to change. The next day was December 26th, Boxing Day, and Thomas was back at the factory. The machines didn't care about holidays. The steam engine was restarted. The looms resumed their thunder. Work continued. January 1843 arrived with brutal cold. The Thames froze in London. Manchester's streets became ice rinks of frozen mud and waste. The factory, already cold, became nearly unbearable. Workers' breath created clouds of vapor. Fingers went numb despite multiple pairs of gloves. The machines, made of metal, were so cold that touching them with bare skin would freeze flesh to metal. Charlotte died on January 15, 1843, in the early morning hours. Mary woke Thomas, her face wet with tears, and he knew immediately what had happened. They sat together beside their daughter's body, holding each other, crying quietly, so as not to wake the other children immediately. There was no money for a proper funeral. Victorian funerals were expensive, with costs for the coffin, the burial plot, the service, easily reaching several pounds, which was months of wages. The poor had two options: a pauper's burial, where the body was buried in a mass grave with dozens of others, or the cheaper alternative of finding a sympathetic church that would allow a simple burial. Reverend Thornbury, despite his sometimes misguided moral lectures, was a genuinely compassionate man. He arranged for Charlotte to be buried in the church cemetery, in a simple pine coffin that the parish provided, at no cost to the family. The funeral was attended by family and a few neighbours who'd known Charlotte. The service was brief. Thornbury spoke about God's mysterious ways and Charlotte being free from suffering now. Words that were meant to comfort, but mostly reminded Thomas that his daughter had suffered unnecessarily because of a system that valued profits over human lives. They buried her in the cold ground, the earth frozen and hard, difficult to dig. Thomas stood at the graveside, holding Mary, watching as his 7-year-old daughter was lowered into the ground, and felt his heart break in ways he hadn't known were possible. That evening, he didn't go home immediately. Instead, he went to the Chartist meeting, his grief transforming into a burning need for action. The meeting was larger than usual, packed with workers who'd experienced their own versions of Thomas's tragedy. The speaker was a man named William Oakes, a skilled machinist who'd been dismissed for union organizing, and now dedicated himself to the movement full time. Oakes spoke with passion about the need for political reform, for laws protecting workers, for an end to the system that treated human beings as disposable tools. He talked about the recent petition to Parliament, signed by millions of workers, demanding universal male suffrage and other reforms. "They will reject our petition," Oakes said, his voice carrying through the crowded room. "Parliament represents property owners, not people. But we must continue to organize, to demonstrate, to demand our rights. Change will not be granted voluntarily. It must be won through collective action." Thomas felt something shift in his understanding. His daughter's death wasn't a personal tragedy. It was a political crime, the result of a system that could be changed through organized effort. He began attending meetings regularly, becoming more involved in the movement. He spoke with other Grimshaw workers, quietly recruiting them to the cause. He distributed pamphlets explaining workers' rights and the goals of the Chartist movement. This was dangerous. Factory owners watched for signs of worker organization. Grimshaw employed informants who reported suspicious activity. Workers caught organizing could be dismissed, blacklisted, even arrested for sedition. But Thomas no longer cared about the danger. Charlotte's death had broken something in him that had kept him safely submissive. He was still afraid, still desperately poor, still exhausted from 7 hours of weekly work. But he was also angry, politicized, and committed to fighting for change. February brought a wave of strikes across Manchester. Workers at several mills walked out, demanding better wages and shorter hours. The strikes were spontaneous, uncoordinated, driven by desperation rather than strategy. Grimshaw's workers debated joining. Thomas argued passionately for striking. Others, including William, were terrified of the consequences. If we strike and win, conditions improve, Thomas argued during a whispered discussion in the courtyard during lunch break. If we strike and lose, we're no worse off than dying slowly under current conditions. If we strike, we'll be dismissed and starved, another worker countered. At least now we have wages. Wages that aren't enough to live on. We're starving slowly instead of quickly. That's our choice. The debate continued for days. Finally, a majority of Grimshaw workers voted to join the strike. On February 20th, 1843, when the morning bell rang, workers arrived at the factory but refused to enter. Mr. Grimshaw appeared, flanked by Mr. Blackburn and several men Thomas didn't recognize. Probably hired muscle from the private security firms that factory owners use to handle labor disputes. Return to work immediately, or you will all be dismissed. Grimshaw shouted. The workers stood firm. Approximately 200 men, women, and children standing in the cold Manchester morning, facing their employer.
We demand fair wages!
Thomas shouted, surprising himself with his boldness. We demand safe working conditions. We demand to be treated as human beings instead of machine parts. You will get nothing but unemployment. Grimshaw snarled. I'll hire new workers by this afternoon. Manchester is full of people desperate for work. You are all replaceable. This was true. Manchester did have thousands of unemployed workers desperate for any job. Strikers could be easily replaced, which was why strikes so often failed. But the workers had made their decision. They stood in silent resistance, a moment of collective power that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Grimshaw made a gesture, and the hired security moved forward, clubs in hand. The situation was about to turn violent, and then something unexpected happened. Workers from other nearby factories, hearing about the strike, began arriving. First dozens, then hundreds, standing in solidarity with Grimshaw's workers. The security men looked nervous. Clubs were effective against small groups, but hundreds of angry workers were a different situation entirely. Grimshaw saw he was outmatched and made a tactical retreat. Fine. Return to work, and I'll consider your demands. We'll negotiate. It was a victory, small and probably temporary, but a victory nonetheless. The workers returned to their machines. The factory resumed operations, and Grimshaw scheduled a meeting for the following Saturday to discuss conditions. Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in months: hope. They'd stood together, demonstrated collective power, and forced their employer to negotiate. Maybe change was possible. The meeting on Saturday was tense. Grimshaw sat behind his desk, looking like a king forced to negotiate with peasants. Thomas and 4 other workers represented the striking workforce. State your demands, Grimshaw said icily. Thomas spoke, his voice steady despite his nervousness. First, we demand the return of wages to their previous level before the recent reduction. Second, we demand safety improvements, including proper guards on all machines and immediate stoppage when accidents occur. Third, we demand an end to arbitrary wage penalties. Fourth, we demand a reduction of working hours to 10 per day. a Grimshaw laugh, a harsh sound without humour. You demand. You have no leverage to demand anything. I agreed to this meeting out of mercy, not obligation. We have the leverage of withholding our labour, Thomas replied. Without workers, your factory is just expensive machinery. Machinery I can operate with replacement workers within days. Workers who would need training. Who would be less productive initially, who would cost you money during the transition. Plus, there's the risk of more strikes, of damage to your equipment, of bad publicity affecting your business relationships. This was a bluff. Workers had very little actual power, but Grimshaw didn't know how organised they were or weren't. After an hour of tense negotiation, they reached a compromise. Wages would be restored to their previous levels, though not increased beyond that. Safety guards would be installed on the most dangerous machines, though not all of them. Arbitrary wage penalties would be reduced, though not eliminated. Working hours would remain 12 per day. It was less than Thomas had hoped for, but more than he'd expected. The wage restoration alone would make a significant difference to his family's survival. The workers returned to work the following Monday with a sense of accomplishment. They'd organised, struck, and won concessions. It wasn't revolution, but it was progress. Thomas's involvement in the strike and Chartist movement had consequences. Mr. Blackburn began watching him more closely, looking for excuses to dock his wages or discipline him. Thomas worked carefully, maintaining perfect attention and productivity, giving them no excuse. But he continued his organising work, now more convinced than ever that collective action was necessary for improving workers' lives. He attended more meetings, distributed more pamphlets, and spoke with more workers about the need for political and economic reform. Spring arrived, bringing warmer weather and marginally better conditions. The factory was still miserable, but at least it wasn't freezing. Thomas's health improved slightly with the restored wages, allowing slightly better nutrition. Mary was pregnant again. A complication they didn't need, but couldn't prevent because birth control was expensive, unreliable, and opposed by religious authorities. Another mouth to feed meant more financial pressure, but it also meant hope for the future, a new life replacing the one they'd lost. William, now 10, had become an excellent scavenger and was being considered for promotion to Pisa, a job that was more dangerous but paid slightly better. Thomas had mixed feelings about this. Pride in his son's competence mixed with horror at what that competence represented. A child becoming skilled at dangerous industrial labour. The Chartist movement was growing nationally. Millions had signed petitions demanding political reform. Public meetings drew huge crowds. There was a sense that change might actually be possible, that the working class might gain political representation and use it to improve their conditions. But there was also growing resistance from the government and wealthy classes. Troops were stationed in industrial cities to suppress potential uprisings. Chartist leaders were arrested on charges of sedition. The establishment clearly had no intention of voluntarily sharing political power. Thomas continued walking the tightrope between survival and resistance, working his 77 hours per week while organising for change in his limited free time. It was exhausting, physically and emotionally, but it gave his miserable existence purpose beyond mere survival. And that, perhaps, was the real story of the Victorian factory worker's daily life. Not just the grinding poverty, the dangerous work, the exhaustion, and the early death, but also the small acts of resistance, the collective moments of power, the refusal to accept dehumanization despite overwhelming pressure. Thomas Blackwell would continue working at Grimshaw's cotton mill for another 15 years, until his lungs gave out and he could no longer breathe well enough to stand for 12-hour shifts. He would never become wealthy or comfortable. He would never escape the working class into which he'd been born. But he would continue organising, continue fighting for workers' rights, continue believing that collective action could create a better world for his children and their children. The Factory Acts would continue to improve gradually, limiting working hours, improving safety conditions, and eventually eliminating child labor entirely. These improvements would come not from the generosity of factory owners, but from the organized demands of workers like Thomas. The Industrial Revolution transformed England from an agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse, creating unprecedented wealth and technological advancement. But that transformation was built on the bodies of workers like Thomas Blackwell, people who operated the machines, breathed the coal smoke, and died young so that others could prosper. Their daily lives were miserable, dangerous, and dehumanizing, but they were also sites of resistance, solidarity, and the gradual birth of workers' rights movements that would eventually reshape industrial societies. Thomas Blackwell was one person among millions, his individual story unremarkable in its details, but representative of a class experience that defined an era. He woke before dawn. He worked in dangerous conditions for inadequate wages. He watched his children suffer and die from industrial diseases. He struggled daily with exhaustion, hunger, and desperation. But he also organized, resisted, and fought for change. He demonstrated that even in the most oppressive systems, human beings retain agency, dignity, and the capacity for collective action. And that, ultimately, is the real story of the Victorian factory worker, not just victims of industrialization, but also agents of their own liberation, fighting daily battles against a system designed to consume them, winning small victories that accumulated into the labor protections we now take for granted. The factory bell continued to ring each morning, summoning workers to their machines. The looms continued their thunder. The steam engines continued to power the Industrial Revolution, but within that mechanical horror, human beings continued to assert their humanity, to demand dignity, to insist that they were more than interchangeable parts in an economic machine. Thomas's story doesn't end with heroic triumph, because working class stories in Victorian England rarely did. But it also doesn't end with simple defeat. It ends with persistence, with the grinding daily effort to survive while simultaneously fighting for something better. The summer of 1843 brought oppressive heat that transformed the factory into a literal sweatbox. Temperatures inside reached over 90 degrees. The humidity made breathing feel like drowning in hot air, and workers began collapsing from heat exhaustion with alarming regularity. Mr. Grimshaw's response was to install water barrels in the corners of the factory floor, a concession to worker survival that cost him approximately 3 shillings and allowed him to feel magnanimous. The water was warm, tasted of iron from the barrels, and had to be shared by 200 workers, but it was liquid, and it kept people alive. Thomas drank from the barrel during his brief breaks, the lukewarm water barely refreshing but necessary. Around him, other workers did the same, their faces red and dripping with sweat, their clothing soaked through. Several women had fainted that week. Overcome by the heat and the corsets that fashion demanded, they wear even while operating heavy machinery. The heat brought other problems. Food spoiled faster, meaning their already limited diet became even more uncertain. The tenement smells intensified. The combination of human waste, rotting garbage, and unwashed bodies creating an atmosphere that could strip paint. Disease spread more rapidly in the heat, with dysentery sweeping through the working class neighborhoods like a biblical plague. Mary's pregnancy was progressing, making her washing work increasingly difficult. By July, she was visibly pregnant, her belly swelling with new life while her body struggled under the combined stresses of malnutrition, overwork, and grief for Charlotte. She continued working, because stopping meant losing income they couldn't afford to lose, but Thomas could see the toll it was taking. "You should rest," he told her one evening, watching her scrub clothing with hands that were raw and bleeding. "And eat what? Pay rent how?" she replied. Not unkindly but realistically. Rest was a luxury for people with savings, and they had none. Agnes had taken over more of the household duties, watching Edward while Mary worked and Thomas was at his multiple jobs. The old woman's arthritis was worsening, her fingers gnarled into claw shapes. But she contributed what she could, because that's what families did when survival was a collective effort. William had been promoted to piecer in June, a development that increased his wages from 2 shillings to 3 shillings per week, but also significantly increased his danger. Piecers worked directly with the machinery, reaching into running looms to tie broken threads. Their small hands and bodies allowing access that adult workers couldn't achieve. Thomas watched his son work with constant anxiety. William was quick and careful, but quickness and care could only reduce risk, not eliminate it. Every day at the factory, Thomas had to consciously not look at William's station, because watching would make him too anxious to focus on his own work. The Chartist movement continued to grow through the summer. The second petition to Parliament had been rejected in May, with members of Parliament treating the working class demands with contempt and mockery. One MP had suggested that workers demanding the vote was like children demanding to drive coaches, a comparison that revealed exactly how the ruling class viewed the people who created their wealth. The rejection had radicalized many workers. If peaceful petition didn't work, what options remained? Some Chartists began discussing more militant action. Thomas attended meetings where speakers talked about general strikes, about armed resistance, about revolution. He was simultaneously attracted to and terrified by these ideas. Part of him wanted to burn down Grimshaw's mill, to destroy the machines that had killed his daughter, to physically attack the system that had caused so much suffering. But another part of him, the practical survivor part, recognized that violence would bring overwhelming state repression and likely accomplish nothing except getting workers killed. The debate within the movement was intense. Some argued for continued peaceful organization. Others insisted that the ruling class would never voluntarily share power and had to be forced through violent revolution. Thomas found himself somewhere in the middle, supporting militant action, but stopping short of endorsing outright violence. In August, there was a massive rally in Manchester with tens of thousands of workers gathering in a public square to demonstrate support for the Chartist demands. Thomas attended with several other Grimshaw workers, walking through the streets in columns, carrying banners demanding suffrage and workers' rights. The rally was peaceful, but the presence of so many organized workers terrified the authorities. Troops were visible on side streets, ready to intervene if the demonstration turned violent. Police watched from rooftops. The message was clear. The state would tolerate protest, but would crush any actual threat to the established order. Speakers addressed the crowd, their voices carrying through the summer air. They spoke of justice, rights, dignity, and the need for political power. The crowd cheered, sang song, and for a few hours felt powerful rather than powerless. But then everyone went home, back to their tenements and factories, and nothing had actually changed. The troops remained. Parliament remained closed to working class participation. The factory owners retained their power. The demonstration had been emotionally satisfying, but practically ineffective. Thomas felt the familiar frustration of political impotence. They could march, petition, and organize, but the ruling class controlled the state apparatus and had no incentive to change a system that benefited them enormously. Still, the organizing continued because what alternative existed? Submission and acceptance would guarantee that nothing ever changed. Resistance at least held the possibility of eventual reform, even if that reform was gradual and incomplete. September brought Mary's labour, which happened at home because hospitals were for the wealthy and emergencies. Agnes served as midwife, a role she'd performed for dozens of working class births over the years. Thomas was sent out of the room because male presence during childbirth was considered inappropriate. So he waited in the courtyard with the other men from the tenement, all of whom had experienced this particular form of anxious waiting. The labour lasted 14 hours, which was normal but felt eternal. Thomas could hear Mary's screams through the thin walls, each one making him flinch. Childbirth in Victorian England was dangerous, with maternal mortality rates that would horrify modern people. 1 in every 100 births resulted in the mother's death, and working-class women with their poor nutrition and overworked bodies faced even higher risks. But Mary survived, and just before dawn on September 23rd, she delivered a healthy baby girl. Thomas was allowed back into the room to meet his daughter, a tiny red-faced creature who screamed with impressive volume. They named her Charlotte, after the daughter they'd lost. It was simultaneously an act of remembrance and hope, a way of honoring the dead while celebrating new life. The baby brought joy, but also additional financial pressure. Mary would need several weeks to recover from childbirth, meaning no washing income during that time. The baby would need clothing, blankets, and eventually food beyond breast milk. Their already tight budget became even tighter. Thomas took on additional hours at Blackstone's ironworks, now working Sunday morning and afternoon, increasing his total weekly hours from 77 to 82. His body was operating far beyond sustainable limits, held together by desperation and the knowledge that his family depended on his wages. He began experiencing worrying symptoms. Chest pains that came during heavy exertion, shortness of breath that had nothing to do with cotton dust, a persistent cough that produced bloody phlegm. He knew these were signs of serious health problems, but ignored them, because acknowledging them would mean stopping work, and stopping work meant starvation. October brought the first frost, and with it a reminder that winter was approaching, that season of increased disease, cold, and death. The tenement needed coal for heating, a major expense that would consume approximately 1 shilling per week throughout the winter months. Without heat, they'd freeze. With heat, they'd barely afford food. Victorian poverty was a constant series of impossible choices. The factory owners prepared for winter by doing absolutely nothing to improve worker comfort. The mills weren't heated beyond the natural warmth of machinery and bodies. Workers would work in near-freezing conditions, their fingers numb, their breath visible, their bodies struggling to operate machinery, while simultaneously trying to prevent hypothermia. Thomas began preparing by collecting any scrap fabric from the factory floor that wasn't being monitored, stealing essentially, but stealing in the service of survival. He brought the scraps home where Mary and Agnes used them to create additional layers of clothing and bedding. Theft was wrong, but letting your children freeze was worse, and Victorian morality didn't offer much guidance for situations where all choices were bad. The Chartist movement was fragmenting by autumn. The rejection of the second petition had created divisions between those favouring continued peaceful organisation and those supporting militant action. Several radical Chartists had been arrested for sedition, including some leaders Thomas had heard speak. The government was clearly attempting to suppress the movement through arrests and intimidation. Thomas attended fewer meetings, partly because of time constraints from his increased working hours, and partly because the movement seemed to be losing momentum. The initial hope that political reform was achievable through organisation and petition had faded, replaced by grim recognition that the ruling class would defend its power through whatever means necessary. But he didn't give up entirely. He continued talking with other workers, continued distributing pamphlets when he could, continued believing that collective action was necessary even if it wasn't currently successful. November brought the first major winter storm, dumping snow on Manchester and transforming the already difficult conditions into something approaching intolerable. The streets became impassable trenches of frozen mud and snow. The walk to the factory took 40 minutes instead of 20, wading through knee-deep snow in darkness. Inside the factory, the cold was brutal despite the running machinery. Metal surfaces became so cold that touching them bare-handed could cause skin to freeze to metal. Workers wore multiple layers of gloves, which made operating machinery more difficult and increased the risk of accidents. There were multiple accidents that month. A young man lost 3 fingers when his gloved hand got caught in a loom mechanism, the thick gloves preventing him from feeling the machine's grip until it was too late. A woman slipped on ice-covered floor and fell into a drive belt, breaking her arm and several ribs. A child working as a scavenger froze to death overnight when he got locked in the factory accidentally and couldn't escape the unheated building. Each accident was investigated perfunctorily, blamed on worker carelessness, and resulted in no changes to factory safety protocols. Mr. Grimshaw expressed regret at each incident, the kind of empty regret that costs nothing and means less. Thomas's health continued deteriorating. The chest pains became more frequent. The bloody cough worsened. He was losing weight despite eating more, his body consuming itself, trying to maintain his impossible work schedule. He looked in the mirror one morning and barely recognized himself, his face gaunt and skeletal, his eyes sunken, his skin grey. Mary begged him to see a doctor, but doctors cost money they didn't have. The charitable hospital was an option, but required waiting hours for service, time he couldn't afford to lose from work. So he continued, ignoring the warning signs, hoping his body would hold together long enough to survive another week, another month, another year. December arrived with the usual Christmas preparations. Grimshaw announced the same Christmas bonus as the previous year. 1 shilling per worker and a day and a half off, unpaid. The workers received this with the same mixed emotions, grateful for any break but aware that unpaid time off meant lost wages during the most expensive season. Thomas's Christmas was more subdued than the previous year, haunted by Charlotte's absence and complicated by baby Charlotte's presence. The new baby was healthy and thriving, but every happy moment with her was tinged with grief for the daughter they'd lost. They had a modest Christmas dinner, slightly less extravagant than the previous year, because their budget was even tighter. A small piece of pork instead of chicken, the usual potatoes and bread. Tea. It was a meal barely celebratory but better than daily fare. The children received small gifts again, though Thomas hadn't had time to carve new toys. Instead, he'd purchased cheap wooden toys from a street vendor, spending 2 pence he couldn't really afford but wanting to give his children something resembling normal childhood joy. William received a small wooden soldier. Edward got a horse on wheels. Baby Charlotte was too young for toys, but received a knitted hat Mary had made during her recovery. The children played with their gifts, while the adults watched, trying to find happiness in the moment, despite the crushing weight of their circumstances. That night, lying in bed next to Mary, with baby Charlotte between them, Thomas felt the full weight of his existence. He was 24 years old but felt 50. His body was breaking down. His daughter was dead. His son worked in dangerous conditions. His new daughter would grow up in the same poverty that had killed her sister. His wife was exhausted and aging prematurely. His life was an endless cycle of labor, exhaustion, and barely avoided starvation. But he was also alive. His remaining children were alive. Mary was alive. They had a roof, inadequate as it was. They had food, insufficient as it was. They had each other. And they had the continued possibility, however remote, that collective action might eventually create a better world. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough. But it was what they had. January 1844 arrived with brutal cold, and the news that Grimshaw was again reducing wages, this time by 15% due to market conditions. The workers were devastated. The previous wage restoration had made survival marginally possible. This new reduction would push many families below subsistence level. There was talk of another strike, but the memory of the previous strike's limited success and the harsh winter conditions made workers reluctant. Striking in summer meant discomfort. Striking in winter meant potentially freezing to death. Thomas argued for striking anyway, but he was outvoted. The workers accepted the wage reduction. Too afraid and too worn down to fight. It was a defeat, a surrender to economic reality, and it felt like dying inside. His wages dropped from 7 shillings and 2 pence to 6 shillings and 1 pence per week. combined with William's 3 shillings. Mary's washing income of approximately 2 shillings, reduced because she was caring for a new baby, and his Sunday work at 18 pence. The family's total weekly income was approximately 12 shillings. Rent was 2 shillings. Coal was 1 shilling. Food for 7 people cost at least 6 shillings, even on the most austere diet. That left 3 shillings for everything else: clothing, soap, candles, medical care, unexpected expenses. They were on the razor's edge of survival, one problem away from complete disaster. Thomas's body made the decision his mind couldn't. In mid-January, while operating his loom, he collapsed. The chest pain that had been building for months suddenly intensified. Feeling like someone had driven a spike through his heart, he fell to the factory floor, gasping for air, his vision tunneling. Workers surrounded him. Mr. Blackburn was called. Pemberton arrived and examined him briefly. Heart strain. Overwork. He needs complete rest for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. Complete rest for 2 weeks. Which meant 2 weeks without wages. Which meant financial disaster. Thomas tried to protest, to stand up, to return to his loom. But his body refused to cooperate. He couldn't breathe properly. His chest felt like it was being crushed. His legs wouldn't support his weight. They carried him home, 2 workers supporting him between them, while he wheezed and gasped. Mary took one look at him and began crying, understanding immediately what this meant. That night, Thomas lay in bed, too weak to move, facing the reality that his body had finally given out. He was 24 years old and physically broken, unable to work, with a family depending on his income. The next 2 weeks were a nightmare of poverty and fear. Without his wages from Grimshaw's mill, the family's income dropped to approximately 6 shillings per week. They ate even less than usual. They burned less coal, huddling together for warmth. They did without soap, candles, any small comfort. Agnes sold her few possessions, items she'd kept for decades, to buy food. Mary took on additional washing work, despite having a new baby, working until her hands bled and her back spasmed. William asked for additional hours at the factory, being allowed to work occasionally in the evening for extra pence. Thomas lay in bed, feeling useless and guilty. His inability to work was killing his family, as surely as his work had been killing him. He tried to recover, to rest as the doctor had ordered, but rest was impossible when you were watching your children grow thinner and your wife work herself to collapse. After 2 weeks, he attempted to return to the factory. His body was barely recovered. His chest still hurt with every breath, but staying home meant continued poverty. He walked slowly to Grimshaw's mill, each step requiring conscious effort. Mr. Blackburn examined him skeptically. "You look half dead, Blackwell." "I can work," Thomas insisted, though he wasn't sure this was true. "Your productivity will be reduced. I'll have to cut your wages accordingly until you're back to full strength." More wage cuts. Of course. Because a worker damaged by overwork should be penalized for reduced productivity. The logic was circular and cruel, but it was how the system worked. Thomas returned to his loom, operating at reduced capacity, earning reduced wages. His chest hurt constantly. His breathing was labored. Every hour of work felt like running a marathon while drowning. But he continued because stopping meant death. Just a different kind of death than the one the factory was inflicting. The winter of 1844 was the hardest of Thomas's life. And given that all his years had been hard, this was significant. The combination of reduced wages, his health problems, Mary's exhaustion, and baby Charlotte's needs created a perfect storm of misery. They fell behind on rent. Their landlord, a man named Ridley who owned half the tenement building, threatened eviction if they didn't pay the arrears. Eviction meant the workhouse, which meant family separation and conditions even worse than their current poverty. Thomas went to the landlord's office and begged for more time. He promised to pay the arrears when he could, to never fall behind again, to do whatever necessary. Ridley, who had heard these promises from hundreds of desperate tenants, was unmoved but agreed to 1 month's extension. probably because evicting tenants in winter meant the room would sit empty until spring, costing him rental income. They avoided immediate eviction, but the debt remained, another weight on Thomas's already crushed shoulders. By March, Thomas realized he couldn't continue working 82 hours per week in his condition. His heart was clearly damaged. The chest pains were constant. He was coughing up blood daily. Continuing at his current pace would kill him within months. He quit the Sunday work at Blackstone's ironworks, reducing his hours back to the 60 hours per week at Grimshaw's mill. This cost them 18 pence per week, a significant loss. But it was either reduce hours or die, and dying would cost the family even more. The lost income meant more sacrifices. They ate even less. Edward, now 6, was withdrawn from the minimal schooling he'd been receiving and sent to work as a scavenger at Grimshaw's mill, adding 2 shillings per week to the family income, but destroying any hope that he might escape factory life. Thomas felt like he was watching his family spiral downward, each crisis forcing them to sacrifice more of their humanity, more of their children's futures, more of their dignity. He tried to maintain hope, to believe in the possibility of change, but hope was difficult when your 6-year-old son was crawling under dangerous machinery to earn pennies. The Chartist movement continued, though Thomas's participation had become minimal due to his health and exhaustion. There was talk of a third petition to Parliament, another attempt to demand voting rights for working-class men. Thomas signed the petition when organisers brought it to the factory district, but he had little faith it would succeed where the previous 2 had failed. Spring arrived slowly, bringing warmer weather that made factory work marginally less miserable, but also bringing disease. Cholera outbreaks swept through Manchester's working-class neighbourhoods, killing hundreds. The disease thrived in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of tenement housing, spreading through contaminated water and poor waste disposal. The Thomas family survived the outbreak through luck more than anything else. Their particular water source wasn't contaminated, or at least not contaminated enough to make them seriously ill. Many of their neighbours weren't as fortunate. Mrs. Patterson and her daughter Emily both died in April, victims of cholera that killed them within days of infection. Thomas attended the funeral, which was a quick burial in a mass grave because paupers couldn't afford individual plots during epidemic conditions. He thought about Mrs. Patterson's husband, killed in a factory accident, about Emily dying at age 8, about the complete waste of human potential that industrial poverty represented. The funeral was attended by dozens of people, all working class, all having lost someone to the same combination of poverty, industrial exploitation, and disease. They stood in the rain, watching as dozens of bodies were buried together, and Thomas felt a solidarity of suffering that was simultaneously heartbreaking and empowering. These were his people. They were suffering the same exploitation, facing the same dangers, surviving the same poverty. And if they could organize together, maybe they could create change that individual resistance couldn't achieve. Summer brought slight improvement in Thomas's health. The warm weather and marginally reduced work hours allowed his body to partially recover. He would never be fully healthy again. His heart permanently damaged, but he reached a sort of equilibrium where he could work without immediately dying. Mary's health was also deteriorating, the combination of washing work, childcare, and chronic malnutrition taking their toll. She was 32 but looked 50, her face lined, her hands destroyed by lye soap, her back permanently bent from years of scrubbing clothing. They were both aging prematurely, their bodies consumed by industrial labour, and they both knew they wouldn't live to old age. Working class life expectancy in Manchester was approximately 37 years, compared to 52 years for middle-class residents. The 25-year difference represented the physical cost of poverty and exploitation. But they continued, because continuing was all they could do. Thomas operated his loom, Mary washed clothing, William pieced threads, Edward scavenged under machines. Baby Charlotte grew despite the malnutrition around her. Agnes mended clothing despite her crippled fingers. The family survived, which was the only victory available to them. By autumn 1844, Thomas had been working at Grimshaw's mill for 17 years, since he was 7 years old. He'd spent more than 2/3 of his life operating looms, breathing cotton dust, risking death from machinery, earning wages that barely sustained life. He'd lost a daughter to industrial disease. He'd permanently damaged his heart through overwork. He'd watched his children forced into dangerous labor. He'd seen countless workers injured or killed. He'd experienced poverty so grinding that it had destroyed his health, his dignity, and most of his hope. But he'd also organized. He'd struck. He'd demanded better conditions. He'd fought for workers' rights. He'd participated in a political movement that, despite its current failures, represented the possibility of eventual reform. And that resistance, limited and often futile as it seemed, was the measure of his humanity in an inhumane system. The Victorian factory worker's daily life was a descent into an industrial hell that consumed human beings to produce cotton goods and owner profits. It was waking before dawn to the factory bell's brutal summons. It was walking through darkness and filth to reach massive brick buildings, filled with thunderous machinery. It was working 12-hour shifts in conditions that ranged from uncomfortable to actively dangerous. It was breathing cotton dust until your lungs became decorative scar tissue. It was watching children operate heavy machinery. It was seeing people dismembered by belts and gears. It was earning wages insufficient for basic survival. It was living in overcrowded tenements without sanitation or heat. It was watching your children die of preventable diseases. It was aging prematurely and dying young. But it was also organizing. It was striking despite the risks. It was demanding rights that the ruling class insisted workers didn't deserve. It was supporting each other through collective action. It was maintaining human dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. It was fighting for better conditions, even when that fight seemed hopeless. It was creating the labor movement that would eventually transform industrial societies. Thomas Blackwell's story was one story among millions, unique in its details but representative in its arc. He was born into poverty. He worked in factories his entire life. He suffered, struggled, and survived. His body was broken by industrial labor. His family lived on the edge of starvation. His circumstances never fundamentally improved, but he also resisted. He organized. He demanded better. He maintained his humanity despite systematic dehumanization, and in that resistance, however limited, he contributed to the slow, grinding progress toward workers, rights that would benefit future generations even if it couldn't save his own. The factory bell continued to ring each morning. The machines continued their mechanical thunder. The Industrial Revolution continued transforming England into an economic powerhouse. But within that system, people like Thomas Blackwell continued to assert their humanity, to insist on their dignity, to demand that they be treated as human beings rather than disposable industrial tools. And that insistence, repeated millions of times over decades by millions of workers, eventually created change. Factory acts continued to improve conditions. Working hours gradually decreased. Child labor was eventually banned. Safety regulations were implemented. Unions gained legal recognition. The workers gained voting rights. The worst abuses of industrial capitalism were curtailed through collective action and political reform. These changes came too late for Thomas and Charlotte and millions like them. But they came. And they came because people refused to accept their exploitation as natural or inevitable. Because they organized and fought and demanded better. Because they maintained hope even in hopeless circumstances. Thomas Blackwell died in 1852, age 32. Of heart failure brought on by years of overwork. He never owned property, never achieved financial security, never escaped the poverty into which he'd been born. His life was, by conventional measures, a failure. But he'd survived for 32 years in conditions designed to kill him by 25. He'd raised children who survived childhood in an era of staggering infant mortality. He'd participated in political movements that would eventually achieve many of their goals. He'd maintained his humanity and dignity despite systematic efforts to destroy both. And that, ultimately, was the triumph of the Victorian factory worker. Not that they transcended their circumstances, but that they refused to be entirely defined or destroyed by them. They remained human in conditions of industrial inhumanity. They fought for better futures even when their own futures were bleak. They created the labour movements that would eventually establish the rights and protections we now consider basic human necessities. The miserable daily life of a Victorian factory worker was a story of exploitation and suffering. But it was also a story of resistance and solidarity, of small victories and persistent hope, of human dignity maintained against overwhelming pressure. Thomas Blackwell's life mattered, not because he achieved wealth or fame or conventional success, but because he represented millions of working people who built the modern world with their labour, who suffered exploitation to create others' prosperity, and who fought for the rights and protections that contemporary workers inherit. His story, brutal and grinding as it was, deserves to be remembered. Because forgetting the cost of industrialization, the human suffering that enabled economic development, would be to dishonor everyone who died building the modern world and to risk repeating their exploitation in new forms. The factory bell that woke Thomas each morning at 4:30 has long since stopped ringing. Grimshaw's cotton mill was demolished decades ago. The tenement where his family lived collapsed and was replaced by modern housing. Manchester transformed from an industrial hellscape into a modern city. But the legacy of people like Thomas Blackwell remains. Every labour protection, every safety regulation, every minimum wage law, every hour limit, every child labour prohibition exists because people fought for them, often at great personal cost. The 8-hour workday, the weekend, workplace safety standards, workers' compensation, unemployment insurance. None of these were gifts from benevolent employers. They were won through organisation, strikes, political action, and the persistent demands of workers who insisted they deserved better. Thomas Blackwell's miserable daily life in a Victorian factory was both unique and universal, individual and representative, a personal tragedy and a collective experience. He was one person, but he was also millions. His suffering was real, but his resistance was equally real. His life was exploitation, but it was also the seeds of liberation. And that is the story that deserves telling, not just the grinding misery of industrial labour, but also the human capacity to resist dehumanization, to organize collectively, to demand dignity, to fight for better futures, even when the present offers only suffering. The Victorian factory worker's daily life was hell. But it was a hell that people refused to accept as eternal or inevitable. And in that refusal lies the beginning of every improvement in working conditions, every expansion of workers' rights, every recognition that human beings deserve to be treated as more than industrial raw material. Thomas Blackwell woke at 4:30 each morning, worked 12-hour shifts in dangerous conditions, earned wages insufficient for survival, watched his child die of industrial disease, and died young from overwork. That was his daily reality. But he also organized, struck, demanded better, maintained his dignity, raised his children with love, supported his fellow workers, and contributed to movements that would eventually create meaningful change. That was equally his reality. Both truths deserve recognition, the exploitation and the resistance, the suffering and the solidarity, the individual tragedy and the collective progress. The miserable daily life and the persistent human hope that tomorrow might be marginally better than today. And that persistent hope, maintained across generations, eventually creates real change.